Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, my fine friends. Welcome to the 27th episode of season 9 of the Tom Petty Project podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Brown. This is the weekly podcast that digs into the entire Tom Petty catalog, song by song, album by album, and includes conversations with musicians, fans, and people connected with Tom along the way. One of those conversations is this week's episode. This is a special non-petty episode of the podcast, and I haven't done one of those in ages. But former guest Jeff Slate reached out to ask me if I'd be interested in talking to him about his new single, which is out now, and the album which it's from, which drops in May. And being a fan of Jeff's work and his writing, it wasn't a hard sell for me to have him back on at all. We had a great chat about throwaway lyrics, production differences when you bring in outside voices, and recording an album with people in remote locations during a pandemic lockdown. Jeff's new album features a glittering array of star names from Dave Stewart to Earl Slick, Duff McKagan, all the way to OG heartbreaker Ron Blair. Take a look in the episode notes for details on where you can find Jeff's music. But for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy my second conversation with the inimitable Jeff Slate.
Tom Petty Project. Tom Petty. Hey, Tom Petty Project.
Okay, so I guess we'll start off, Jeff, with thanks for coming back, by the way. First of all, you're my first repeat visitor. So this episode is going to be called Jeff Slate Returns. Very ominous.
Return of the Slate. There you go.
And you'd reached out because you have some pretty exciting news. You got a new single out right now, and a new album coming out in, I believe, May.
You are correct about that.
So we thought this would be a good time to touch base and talk about some of that stuff, and maybe a little Tom Petty connection with this single that's coming out, Broken Without You.
There is, it's already out, and there is a Petty connection, and there's several Petty connections on the record. Now that I think about it, there's even more. So the single was co-produced by Dave Stewart, who obviously worked on Southern Accents with Tom and was instrumental in helping the Wilburys to happen because they used his house and so on and so forth. And he was very tight with Tom and Bob, actually, and George Harrison, of course. So I had this song that was, whenever you're making an album, you try to overwrite, you try to come up with 15 or 20 songs that are going to get whittled down to 10 or 11. And we had it down to, I guess it was 10 or 11, but there was one that I was contemplating dropping, and the producer was like, it's just not happening, but this is a good song.
Yeah.
Neither of us, when you've been working on it for a year, we were doing this in the pandemic, so it's very difficult, or the tail end. When you're down in the weeds like that, it's like any project. When you've been at it for so long, it's hard to see the forest for the trees. And I happened to be weirdly talking to Dave Stewart on the phone about something unrelated. And because I had interviewed him and we hit it off and kept in touch. And I don't remember what we were talking about now. I think maybe he was coming to town. And he said, as you do, what are you working on? Or what's going on? And you're like, so I had just gotten off the phone with the producer. And I complained about this. And he said, oh, well, why don't you send it to me and I'll see what I can do to fix it up. And I was like, well, sure. He's a guy who's made a few hit records in his life. So I did. And it's funny, you can hear when the album comes out, both versions are available. This is like a single bonus track, but the original version is on the album. And, the original version isn't that different, but he's a guy who obviously knows how to mix a hit record, and he knows what to add and subtract that lifts it, and so immediately when he sent it back to me, it sounded like a completely different song. It wasn't, but it was too. So the great thing about these guys is they just do it for fun. Like, it was just here's the thing about Dave. He's got a studio on an island in the Atlantic where, the island is like several miles long and about a mile wide. He's pretty much the only major business on the island, you know? I mean, it's not like, yeah, he's got a pretty good life out there. It's funny because I said to him, oh, hey, you know, maybe we'll come out and just do something. Because when he suggested that, I said, well, maybe we'll just come out. Earl Slick, who's working on the album with me, maybe we'll just come out and do something from scratch. He said, I don't think I have enough room for that many people. That's two people. So, so he's like, you could come, but it might be a little cramped. Anyway, you know, he sent it back, and it really did change the atmosphere. And I think that's the best way to think of it, is the atmosphere had shifted, and also my relationship to the mix and the song and so on had really changed. And so I, you know, forwarded it on to my label, and he was, I mean, first of all, anybody who runs a record label is thrilled when you submit something that sounds so polished, but you know, that you have Dave's name on it and his blessing and all this other stuff. You know, I mean, it doesn't mean as much as I think people think it does.
Yeah.
I wish it meant more, but it meant something to me, you know, it meant something to me that he wanted to be involved, that he didn't send it back and go, you know, I don't know what to do, or, you know, it's just not that good or whatever.
Yeah.
You know, really good guy and funny. And, you know, before I had interviewed him, this is quite a while back now, the guy who was mixing my record said to me, you know, you try to figure out what's the deal with this Dave Stewart guy. I mean, he's friends with Bob Dylan, he's friends with Tom Petty, he's friends with George Harrison, Ringo, you know, all these guys that we idolize. What is it about this guy? And, you know, the thing about it, he's a great hang. He's really, I mean, he's as nuts as they are, you know, and I think I'm not saying anything out of school. I think he would freely admit that, but he's also just, he's really smart. He's funny, which I think goes a long way with those guys. And look, I think, you know, it counts for something in that crowd when you've had some success and it's not a, you know, it's, you know, there's no games involved.
Yeah.
You know? So anyway, it was really a thrill. And then as far as the record goes, Jeremy Stacy plays drums on a couple of tracks, and Jeremy was on Benmont Tench's record.
Okay.
And he was all on his solo record, which I guess is how I met. I don't even remember how I met Jeremy, but he was also Noel Gallagher's live drummer for a long period of time, and his twin brother still works with Noel. And Jeremy still does a lot of the drums on Noel's recorded work, but he's an exceptional session musician and live drummer, of course. He's played with, like I said, Benmont and Tom Jones, and just, you know, this endless list of people. So he's on a couple of tracks, and then Ron Blair, who is an OG heartbreaker, plays not just bass, but plays guitar and slide, you know, like pedal steel on one track, and, you know, bass on a couple of tracks. So yeah, I mean, it's, you know, these were just, you know, the genesis was around 2020. At the beginning of 2020, we had plans to go out on the road at the end of the year, like everybody else. So that was going to be me and Earl Slick, and, you know, whoever the band was going to be at that time. And so we were going to make a record to sell at shows and to, you know, as you do. And when the pandemic hit, obviously the tour went out the window pretty quickly, because even though it was planned for October and this was like May or June, you know, it takes time. You've got to, you know, there's insurance and promoters and all that other stuff that I don't get involved in, but, you know, people needed to know, are we going to do this or not? So I thought, well, you know, I have this time set aside to at least make a record. And I had the songs I thought, you know, that I wanted to do. But then I figured, you know, I've got all this time, like everybody. Why don't I use that time to write as much as I possibly can, see what I come up with. It's a relatively, I think for anybody, it was a relatively reflective time, sort of thoughtful time.
Of course, yeah.
But I thought, I might come up with something different or, more inspired and also just to sort of play through what I had and edit. Editing is always a good thing. And it's a hard thing to do, I think, because these songs are very much like your babies. And so I did. And we released one song at the tail end of 2020 called Heartbreak, and the response was very positive. That had, again, Slick was on that, Duff McKagan was on that, a couple of the guys from Paul Weller's band and so forth. So it was nice. It was nice. Jordan Summers, who played at the El Rey show we did for Tom a couple of years ago, pre-pandemic, and Lee Harris from Saucerful of Secrets. It was like a really nice group of people. And what we realized was we were able to make a record that sounded like a band in a room in the pandemic, which is a trick, and I think that was the producer I was working with and the mixer I was working with. Eric Lichter is the producer, a guy I've been wanting to work with for many, many years. He's got a very sort of Americana, Laurel Canyon vibey studio up in Connecticut in the woods, and Dwayne Lundy, who mixed it, who's in Kentucky, and he's worked with, Willie Nelson and Ringo and, all the, just his list is amazing. And so I thought, okay, well, we were still in the midst of it. And I thought, well, I'm gonna dig in and see what I can come up with. And like I said, I would sit at my kitchen table a couple of nights a week and just sort of chip away. And some songs were, felt like they were rising above, and others did not. And, and so that was the process. And then just contacting people, Ron Blair, like everybody else I contacted, was kind of just sitting around. He built a recording studio. He was, just about the beginning of the pandemic, he built this recording studio. He had nothing but time on his hands.
Yeah.
So when you say like, hey, can you put bass on a couple of these tracks, he was, more than happy to. And he had lots of ideas, which was really cool, because this is a guy obviously who's been in a few recording studios in his life. So that was largely how it came together. But there's a nice Heartbreakers connection to it, which feels good. I mean, I asked Ferroni, but it just didn't work out, and I asked Ringo actually, and that didn't work out. Ringo's very picky, obviously, and Benmont was in Italy, and there were just things that couldn't happen. But pretty much anyone who had a home studio, a full-on home studio, who felt comfortable with the quality they could record at, was willing to do something.
Well, I think though that it does speak to the strength of your songwriting. That these are song people. Like you said, Dave Stewart's a song guy, right? I mean, he's just a brilliant ear for a song, and whether albums or projects all come into that as well. He's got to like a song. So clearly, for this first single, this lead single, Dave Stewart thought, yeah, this is a good song. So I think that's testament to, it must be a nice validation as a songwriter where, yourself whether something's got some legs. Like you said, when you're doing that self-edit, you can hear, yeah, that's just something there I can work with. But when someone else validates that, that's got to be a nice thing, right? As a songwriter, to say, yeah, okay, well, that's good then. If people are seeing this, then clearly I'm on the right track.
I mean, yes, I don't want to be, I mean, it's hard to tell. I look at it this way. These people are my friends. Yeah. And when you ask a friend, if you ask a friend to move a couch, they don't want to do it, but they're going to move the couch. Right? So I don't know if Dave did it because he felt like he had to move the couch or because he liked the couch, So yeah. That's the self-effacing part of me that I would like to, but I don't want to get big-headed about it either. It's like you always feel, I really genuinely believe that this is a sort of turning point stylistically for me, that the quality of the songwriting and the recording is head and shoulders above the last 4 records, or three records, I guess it is, that I made as a solo artist. That's my personal feeling. But I think until people start to hear it and respond to it, for somebody who's your friend to say, oh, I really like this, you know, I don't tell people I like something unless I really do, but that's me. I think most people, it's an awkward situation to put them into. But yes, I mean, the answer to your question is yes.
Yeah.
that any one of these people who sends me a message that they like it, or they and musicians, of course, will pick out a particular piece.
Yeah.
They're very, but look, simple as I shared the news on Instagram last week, and Benmont commented on it, and I'm just a kid who grew up loving the Heartbreakers.
Yeah.
That's like, he was like, hooray. And he genuinely wishes me well. And I think that means a lot to me, not just because he's become my friend, but because, his well wishes count for something. So yeah,
And I would always take that at face value too, right? I mean, that is because you said, I mean, you're just a kid who grew up listening to the Heartbreakers. Well, Benmont was just a kid who grew up listening to all the people he grew up listening to. So it's the same
absolutely.
thing. It's just a
Absolutely.
different scale, right? So there's no, we do, people who are not sort of either connected to or have that sort of line on the inside of the music business or that side of it. Musicians kind of just like playing songs and playing instruments and collaborating and hearing things that get them off, right? I mean, that's why we all do it. And like you said, I mean, I think that's a really good point that, a musician will say, oh, I love the middle eight there. I love what you did, or I love that dynamic change. And I've made a lot of notes on the song that you've released so far that we'll probably get into some of it, but I made way too many to cover all of them. But I did want a quick comment though, and because you'd said something there that it feels like maybe a bit of a sea change for you. And I think that your vocal on this one definitely feels a lot more sort of subtle, or not softer. Soft is the wrong word, because it sort of, you can sort of read into lacking power there, but it just feels like you've deliberately pulled that back from where you usually sit. It's a bit gentle, a bit warmer, and it's almost like a crooning style delivery where you definitely have a good rock voice and you can belt. So I was kind of curious whether that was, and whether it's just this song or whether it's more the album. Where did that come from?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I had recorded, I think, all of the vocals here in my home studio, and produced them myself. Some of them were placeholders, some of them were what we call scratch vocals, and some of them, even when you do a scratch vocal, sometimes you just fall in love with it and it becomes the vocal because you capture something. But I went to my friend Mark Platty's recording studio. So Mark worked with Dave Bowie in the 90s. He's worked with The Cure and Delight and Prince and a whole host of artists. But he's most known for his work with David Bowie in the 90s. And he has the same studio there that he did when he worked with David, and we were there doing backing vocals. So he did some, I did some, and the vocalist from my live band, Shannon Conley, who people will have seen at the Tom Petty weekend in Gainesville. She came in, so she did a little harmonica. We're just doing, this is like final fun. Just kind of like putting the icing on at the very end. And he has this beautiful microphone, like an old, a vintage, warm sounding microphone, which is probably worth 50 times what my microphone here at my home studio is. He's an actual producer. So and there was one vocal I wanted to take a stab at because I just wasn't happy with it, and I went in to the vocal booth when everybody was done, and I said, hey, if we've got, we had a little bit of time, let me just go in there and see what I can do. So I went in and literally just sang. We were all warmed up and it felt good, and all the stars were aligning. But I went in there and one take. I don't remember what song it is, unfortunately, but it was, there might have been one or two fixes, but I think it was like beginning to end a performance. And because when you're hearing yourself back with that quality and subtlety, your performance changes.
Yeah.
You know, you will give a different spin to what you're doing. So, you know, we got to the end and he was like, wow, that's it. Right. And I was like, wow, that's great. And I was like, you know, I'm kind of not happy with this other song. Should we just take a stab at it? And it was sort of the same thing. Again, it wasn't maybe 100% perfect. I can't remember, but it was, you know, pretty close. Maybe only needed, but because of the vibe had changed, the way I was approaching them as a vocalist had changed. And I think also I had lived with these songs through the pandemic and piecing them together, the sort of jigsaw puzzle way of doing it, from getting, you know, pieces from LA and pieces from the South Atlantic and pieces from Europe and, you know, whatever, nuts. So I had a pretty, there was an intimacy with the material that was almost, you know, like it wasn't they weren't my songs anymore. You know, they like, not that they were covers per se, but I knew them so well. It was like I was performing somebody else's material, you know? So I think that lends itself to, you know, for me, a looseness that maybe I don't usually have. And I usually tend to do the vocals fairly early in the process. This was fairly late in the process. But you're right. There were it was sort of a perfect storm of things that led to that style. But I you know, that's a pretty good catch, because you're the second interview I've done that has brought that up. And you know, when you're down in the weeds, you don't really think about that stuff.
Yeah, you don't have enough distance from it to actually see it, right? And especially
and that was the thing with Dave fixing this song. He didn't do very much, but what he did do was such a sea change to me. You know, he added a little guitar, he changed the mix around, you know, it's like, it wasn't night and day, but it was to me, because when you're so in it, you know, it's really hard. Yeah.
Well, and I'm really looking forward to hearing that now, because I
thought we sent you the whole thing, but we will.
No, definitely. Yeah. Because I mean, that's what I do on my podcast. I dig into these songs at a level that no one needs to hear me talking about, but just that's where the joy of that is. And that's where I think you learn about music, because again, if I listen to that version, then this version, and like I said, it might not be one version is better than the other, but if it's different, you think, just putting that there changes that dynamic, or it changes the feel of how that transition works. It can just change it 100%. Right, and just make it something different and something new, which is why I love the stuff that we got, you know, from the Petty Estate, all those, you know, you get the original takes or the demos. You think, oh man, the evolution of that song is just so cool to see.
Yeah. Well, that's a whole other animal. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you about then the lyrics on this one, the single the one that I've heard so far, but it definitely sounds personal, this song, because that's the way I live with 30 Years of Hurt. Does not sound like a throwaway line. It doesn't sound like a place, or it doesn't sound like something, well, that'll fit. It feels like there's something in there. It feels like there's a little bit of a story behind that line. It's
funny because it's 100% a throwaway line.
Oh, nice.
That line, I was literally, the thing about this song that's really interesting is I sat down at my kitchen table one night with the chord progression and not much else, and was sort of like flipping through my book of lyrics and had maybe an idea or two. I can't remember what the lines were, and it just came from there, but it was not I've talked about this elsewhere, but you know, there's inspiration and perspiration, you know, and sort of, it was not a song born necessarily of inspiration, but it wasn't hard either. It wasn't perspiration. It was more sort of craftsmanship. Like, I know how to write a song.
Yeah.
And I had it in my head. I had that, the verse chords, and in my head, I heard the Smiths.
Okay.
Which you wouldn't get that from the finished product. And so the repeated, you know, how the words repeat.
Yeah.
That felt to me Smithsy or 80s-y. And then the 30 Years of Hurt was just a line that fit. And I literally thought it's like the movement you need is on your shoulder. And John was like, no, I know what that means. You got to keep it.
Yeah.
That was like, well, that's not true. I don't know what was happening 30 years ago. It just fit, the meter and the tone of the song. So it's funny. Wrong. No, I don't know.
That's awesome though, because it's
Yeah.
almost even better as a songwriter, right? When you have that and you think, actually, you see that written down, you have that line somewhere else, or you think, well, that's a good line, but I don't have any place to put it. And all of a sudden it's like, aha, this is exactly where that line can go, or this is exactly the line I need here. Even if it is, we use the word throwaway. We're not being dismissive when we say that, but we just mean it's not written from
100%.
that's so cool though, right? I love that. I love that I'm wrong on that. But I do hear, you're saying the influences are the Smiths, whatever, but I do sort of hear little bits of, like Paul Weller, like Wildwood era Paul Weller, or the Pretenders, or that kind of stuff. So it's got, I don't know why, but to me, it's got like an English sound to it. And I don't know if it's just me connecting Dave Stewart to that, but it sounds more English than American.
Yeah, I mean, I think the bulk of the musicians, certainly the rhythm section, I mean, the drummer is Paul Weller's drummer on
Okay.
almost all the tracks, Ben Gordelier, and then on the other tracks is Jeremy Stacey, who's also an English drummer.
Yeah.
They have a different way of playing, which I really like. It has a more, it swings differently than American drummers.
Yeah.
I think for Heartbreakers fans, it's the difference between sort of Stan and Ferroni. Ferroni's very precise. He's very he's got sort of a very session set. He's an amazing drummer. I played with him.
Yeah.
He's like a freight train behind you. But but Stan has that kind of Ringo thing. It's a little bit behind, and it's a little bit swingy, and so if they can relate that way, that's a very English style of playing, even though Stan is not the English guy in that bunch. But anyway,
Yeah.
I think Weller put out 2 records at the beginning of the pandemic. He had just put out one, and then he put out another right, end of 20, beginning of 21. I was listening to that a lot, his music a lot, and he's sort of very like Tom to me, in that his work ethic is incredibly strong, and the quality of his songwriting is always very, very, very high. There's not, like with Tom's catalog, you can go through it. It's very hard to find, even in an album you don't love, there's plenty of songs that you do, and I think that's the same with Weller. I mean, I know there are plenty of people who were Jam fans who didn't like the Style Council, or who were Style Council fans who didn't like the solo stuff or the Jam, or whatever it is. But over time, I think they've all realized that the quality, the caliber of his work is just very, very high. He drives himself really hard. So I think, I was listening to that a lot, but I also, I know him a bit, and our taste is similar. I mean, I just did a podcast. I was guest DJ on a show that's sort of Weller related, the Captain Stack show, which is, sort of within that fan world. And all the songs I picked, I didn't pick any Weller songs, I mean, they played my single, obviously. I played a Small Faces song, but everything else for the hour and a half I did this were, it was like the Delphonics and the OJs and the, it's like that early 70s, old school R&B and soul, not modern in any way, really old school, pre-disco. That's what I grew up on. That's what I loved.
Yeah.
If I wasn't listening to kind of the Kinks or the Who or the Small Faces, the Beatles, those were my guys. Then it was the 45s I'd gotten from various family members, and particularly my brother-in-law, because he was a session guy and he did tours and stuff with a lot as a horn player. So he played with like the Spinners and things. And that's the music I go back to. So, I don't think you necessarily hear it um, obviously that there's a, that the connection, the intimate connection I have to, you know, late 60s, early 70s Black American soul music. But by the same token, I think Tom had that too, and you don't hear it. I mean, it's there,
Yeah.
and it's what's, part of it is those records were made fast, but at a really high level of quality. There was an intensity to them, and I think that's something that Weller brings to it. I think that's something that Tom certainly brought to record making. But yeah, it's funny. It's funny you should say that. I mean, I don't hear. Look, the Smiths was just the idea in my head.
Yeah.
It's funny because somebody asked me the other day, because I do know Johnny Marr, and she was like, "Oh, hey, have you played it for Johnny? You should play that for Johnny. See what he says." Because it doesn't say. He'd be like, "What the fuck are you doing?" If I'd had him put that sort of arpeggio guitar on it,
yeah,
which I now hear in my head, but it would have been a different animal. But I also think that wasn't what I was going for. It was just sort of, that was the starting point. The ending point was something completely else. And that's where the craftsmanship comes in.
Yeah, and I think that's where I do this lots when I'm listening to songs. I'm talking to people who've written songs. It drives my best friend crazy sometimes. I was like, oh, that sounds really policey. And it's not that it's not where you're not cribbing a line, you're not doing something that is overt, but there is a feel about it. And
There's
it's like indescribable and undefinable things. I don't know why it sounds English to me. I don't know why I get kind of these little hints of Chrissy Hine might sing that line that way. You know what I mean? Like, it's just those little weird things. But I think the thing, directly with Weller and Tom is what joins them is to me is that attention to detail. The work ethic behind, okay, good enough's not good enough, right? Good enough is that's for other people. We're going to make this as perfect as we can make it. And that attention to detail, I think, like I said, from this song that I've heard so far, is right there. There's lots of little bits in this song that when I do my active listening is what I think that's what I call it. I don't know if that's the real thing. That's what drummers do when they're listening to parts.
Yeah.
When I'm breaking down a song, it's okay. I'm looking for moments in songs. I'm looking for things that are like, oh, that's cool. I like that little bit. So there's the line after. We've got this French section in this song, which I wasn't expecting. I don't speak French. I don't know what that lady is singing. But there's a bit in it after
Couldn't
that.
even tell you.
When it comes in, when you sing, when springtime comes, I will be there, and then you get the "You will be loved" call and response, and then on the last line of that section, when your heart turns, you will be loved, and that line it's doubled with "I will be there," and then you get "You will be loved" again. So just those little production choices, those little things, it's the little sauce that you can add on, right? Just to make the meat taste a little bit better. And I thought there's lots of those little moments in this song. I was like, yeah, this is a really, really good sign for the rest of this album if it's this good.
No, that's and it's funny. I had a very mixed relationship with this song. I didn't feel like it maybe wasn't in my top 5.
Right.
And the label was really like, they wanted that to be the first single.
Yeah.
We've already put out Heartbreak and The Poacher, which are both on the record, but they wanted this to be the first, in the run up to the May release. There's going to be at least 1 or 2 more. This is what they wanted to do. And I and the next single, which they've already chosen, it's not what I would choose. But then Elton didn't choose Benny and the Jets. He was against Benny and the Jets. It's like, what do I know? And I think that's part of it too. It's like, I know how to make a record, and I know how to do that part of it. The marketing part of it, I'm fine. I can do this and sell and talk about the record and making whatever, tell stories. But the actual, salesmanship of it and marketing of it and the business of it, I don't want to have anything to do with that. That's let them choose, and let them choose the artwork, and let them choose. I just don't, if I hate something, I'll speak out. But
You're not as married to that side of it as you are to, because your job as a musician and as a creator, as a songwriter, is to do the best job with the song that you can. And unfortunately, these days, obviously, most indie artists have to be promoters, social media experts, they're brilliant in interviews, and some people just aren't. And it's a difficult barrier to entry for a lot of folks, right? But I think you've got a great balance of it. So
well, and I'm in a very lucky place where a lot of, what I do as both a writer and a performer, they go hand in hand, because a lot of the people I've gotten to know because I'm a writer, but then they've gotten to know my music and they like it. So then we become friends on a different
Yeah.
level. I mean, Dave didn't do this because I was going to do him a favor and write a story, but I mean, I can't, that doesn't help anybody.
Yeah.
It's like he just did it because we hit it off, and you're right. I mean, if he couldn't have done something with it or didn't like it or whatever, I'm sure he would have said, I tried and couldn't, because
Yeah.
his name is, I said, can we put your name on this?
Yeah.
And he was like, I don't care what you do. That was like actually that's amazing. That's crazy
Yeah.
talk, so yeah.
I don't know though. Like you said, I mean, once you get to that level, if you're Dave Stewart and you're Jeff Lynne and those guys who've been around, I mean, their reputation at this point is fairly bulletproof anyway.
Sure.
So they can take a chance on something that, people maybe wouldn't expect them to do. But again, I think that that's where I always relate to people like that and artists like that, because again, I think they're doing it for the song. They at some level they believe in that song and they think that it's strong enough and it's good enough that let's get behind it. Like I said, I mean, I would, everyone's always self-effacing, and this is the thing with musicians. Oh, yeah, rock stars are all arrogant. No, a lot of them are really,
No, we're incredibly insecure. I
introspective
don't know
and
what people are talking
insecure.
about, Like if you meet somebody at the wrong moment, or you approach them in the middle of dinner or at the mall, or whatever it is, you may not get the response you want. But I think if you talk to them on any meaningful level about the work they do, we're all no matter who I've met, everybody has some insecure. I mean, unless you're, I was going to say, unless you're Jimmy Page or Pete Townsend, but they're insecure too in their own way.
David Lee Roth. There's the name. That's what I'll put in that category. If you, someone whose ego is just so big and so bulletproof that nothing can get through, David Lee Roth is your man.
Yeah, but that's a show. I think that's a show. But
I wonder.
That's a whole other podcast.
Yeah, that's a whole other. I've got a friend who do a Van Halen podcast, and we talk a lot about it in the Discord server. So, yeah. Well, getting back to this song. So, what did that French language piece come in? Because the female vocalist on this is it pronounced Easy?
YC.
YC.
She was part of Noel Gallagher's band for a while when he did the Dave Holmes record a couple of years ago. Yeah, I mean, it was something during the pandemic, and I was like, could you do something in French here?
Right.
Like, and I don't, it's funny because we're performing it now live. We're going to start. We have a show on Friday night, and the vocalist who sings with us, who's here in New York, has to learn this.
Yeah.
And just by coincidence, her vocal coach is French, and I'm like, wow, that's not very rock and roll, but go for it. Whatever you need to do, because there's some talk. We're gonna have to do some TV and things like that, and there's like, it's exciting, but so you want it to sound good.
Yeah.
But yeah, to me, it's at a certain point in record making, it stops becoming you, and it starts becoming this song that exists. At a certain point, every painter has to step away and accept it is finished.
Yeah.
And I think at that point, your relationship to the piece of work shifts. That it can't be changed, but also it's a bit at arm's length, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just part of the song now to me,
Yeah, for sure. My best friend who I hang out with, who produces the songs that I write on, and he says that when he writes, basically, because he's he plays regularly, he's a gigging musician, similar to you, and so he says that once you've written the song, recorded it, you get it finished, and finished is obviously always in air quotes, but he says then what you've got to do is figure out how to cover that song on stage, right? Because now you're covering your own work, because okay, well, I don't have exactly that singer, or I don't have this bass player, and they're not going to play it exactly the same. that section, I kind of wish we'd done this. So maybe we'll try that out and we'll see if that works on stage, if
Yeah.
people react to it. So things do evolve, but they evolve on stage, right? The record is set. Are you sort of, when you look back at that, if you look back at stuff you did sort of 10, 15 years ago, do you look back at old work fondly? Or are you one of those guys who really only sees, man, I wish I hadn't done that, or I really wish I'd done this? Or are you okay living in the bones of those old songs the way they came out?
I was just talking about this with Earl Slick the other day, that, when you put out a record, you hear, and when you're making a record in particular, you can hear all the mistakes. You hear all the things you would have done differently. 10 or 15 years later, the stuff that was driving you insane, that you wanted to change, or that was, keeping you up at night, it all disappears.
Yeah.
Now, I don't think that's true for everybody, but I think it's certainly true for anybody who's made more than 5 or 10 records. I mean, I think if it's, look, I've been doing this now since I was a teenager, I've made a lot, I don't know, a lot of records, 10, I don't know, studio records, more, I guess. It's very hard to, they just are what they are. Now, I also, I'm not really actively, like you talked about active and passive. I'm not really actively listening to, like, I don't choose to put on a record I made 15 years ago.
Of course. Yeah.
Occasionally I have to for a reissue. There may be a remix, or there may be something somebody wants for film or TV or whatever it is. And I have to go back and kind of listen through some things. But yeah, they just are what they are at a certain point. I mean, look, I think, there's this great story about George Martin went to visit John Lennon at the Dakota in the late 70s. And John had been very unkind about George as a producer in the press. And at one point, George Martin says, the way he told it is, he said to John, is it true you hate all those records and that you'd re-record them all if you could? And John said, absolutely. And he said, even Strawberry Fields? And John went, especially Strawberry Fields.
Yeah.
Oh, that's crazy.
Yeah.
That's as perfect an encapsulation of that moment in time as could exist. And yet, as the artist, all he heard was the flaws. So I relate to that part of it, but I also feel like you gotta let that go. The only thing that gnaws at me is there's always things you feel like you could have done better.
Right.
That later in life, later in my career, I've thought I could have edited those lyrics. I could have lifted that song better. I could have, but there's, they are what they are. And, as the writer, I get to perform however I want. So if I drop a verse or change a verse or whatever, it's like Dylan,
Yep.
They're living, breathing things. You just approach them however you want, I think.
And that's the far end of that spectrum, is Dylan, right? That's the sort of the far end of the evolution.
The record is just one part of it.
Yeah.
It is a living, breathing entity that you can approach at any time from any point of view.
So you talked about, you've been doing this for a long time now. Your process, I assume, and the song that we're talking about here, Broken Without You, you said like it's a chord progression that obviously I'm sure you're just sitting around strumming and then think, wait a minute, that kind of sounds, I quite like that. And you've got that F sharp minor passing chord. Oh, there's something there. I can do something with that. And then you go back and you obviously then you write lyrics, I think. So the way that you write songs and when you think about, going back and thinking, well, I don't like that, or maybe sometimes you think, I wish I'd spent more time with that. As you've gotten older, has the way that you write changed? And as you're sort of self-editing, has it changed? Has it improved in your mind? Like, how has that grown as you've grown as a songwriter?
I think early on, I used to sit down, when you're young and just starting to write, you hit a patch where it's just pouring out, and you will sit down and write 3 or 4 songs in a day.
Yeah.
And they feel, and I mean, like, sit down with a guitar and beginning to end, write the lyrics, and it'll all be fully formed. And I think at that point, it's very hard to step back and see and edit, and
Right.
like that I could make this better, because you think everything you do at 24 or 25 is genius. It's like, this is amazing.
Yeah.
I think what you realize later in life is you're not a genius, and that editing and fine tuning really do make demonstrable improvements.
Yeah.
Because, like we were just talking about, this is forever. This is going to be the record.
Yeah.
Like you got to live with this until you die. So, there's a record where we're working on the reissue of the first album I ever put out with my sort of punky band in the 80s from 84, 85. So it's an anniversary reissue. And, it's pretty tough going to listen to some of that stuff. Because I get why Weller doesn't want to play those songs at 66.
Of course.
You're not that person. You're not 18, 17, 18, 19 years old. So, but, you have to sort of separate yourself out from that, and it's a historical piece of this. Anyway, by the same token, the bulk of these songs were that kind of plucked from the sky thing. They really were songs that I didn't sweat too much over.
Right.
There was some fine tuning. There were some lyrical changes here and there. There were a couple that I just couldn't get this verse. I just couldn't get this. And where they started and where they ended may have been very different to me. But if you or anybody else were to hear them, you'd have to really pay attention to see the differences. So I think it's, sometimes you're just in a place where, the last record I made, Secret Poetry, was very much, it was hard work. And I think people like it, but it's not my favorite record for kind of that reason.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean, like, I hear the songs and I'm like, oh, it's better than I remember. But that's a weird relationship to have with your songs, like better than I remember. Yeah. Whereas there are people who ask for those, like, could you play this? Could you play that? Whatever it is. There's kind of only two songs on that record that we play with any regularity, and really only one. So I think it's records, albums, whatever the kids call them these days, are time capsules. They're moments in time. Sometimes you're in a great creative space. Sometimes you're on a deadline. Sometimes it's a bit of both. Sometimes, it's like, it's very hard. And I can remember where I was in all of those records. If you put it in front of me, and I can sort of, flash back to that. Yeah. This was a really unique time. I mean, I think a lot of people use the pandemic to sort of churn out stuff. And I didn't. I had the time, and then the label, because once we made the deal and the pandemic was over, and it was like, okay, well, now we can put out the record and you could tour it. Then everybody was putting out records and touring it. So, like, do you want to put out a record when nobody's going to pay attention? Yeah. Because so it was originally going to be, more a year-ish ago, and then it was going to be last fall. But, last fall was the Christmas rush. And so how do you get, not just guys like you, but anybody to pay attention if they're inundated with new releases? Yeah. So the label, so the record's been in the can for more than a year, but the almost a year and a half now, but the label was insistent, and it made sense to me that, do you want to put it out when nobody's going to pay attention? Do you want to put it out when you have a chance of getting people to listen to it? Of course you want people to listen to it. Yeah. So, I'm already well on to the next two or three, but, so it's actually fun to go back and to look at it and say, this was a moment in time where I really worked hard to do the best that I could, and use that sort of David Bowie approach where you're like a casting director. Like, I know who it's not, I didn't just use who was available because everybody was available.
Yeah.
It was like, I knew the 2 tracks that Ron is on for Petty fans. I knew that he was the right guy for those songs. I knew his style was right for those songs. They have a Heartbreakers vibe.
Right.
And particularly those are the 2 tracks that Jeremy Stacey plays the drums on. He's very like Stan. He has a very Stan Ringo kind of style. Okay. So I thought, well, that's gonna work, right? So yeah, you're a little bit playing casting director, but I had the luxury of no deadline.
Yeah.
You know, these things are always made on deadline, even if it's self-imposed. You know, like, I'm going to be doing shows, and that was part of it. You know, we knew we were doing the Petty weekend down in Gainesville, and I was really pushing them, like, let's get it out so I can have it for. I think we did 15 shows last October. That's, yeah, including those. Why wouldn't I want to have product to sell?
Yeah.
But the label was like, okay, well, that's fine, but it's not like you're never going to have more shows. And I think you should just, they were looking at a bigger picture.
Yeah.
How do you get Mojo to pay attention? How do you get Uncut? How do you get Record Collector? How do you get guys like you to pay attention? You can't do it at a time when everybody's inundated.
Yeah, for sure. And that's where you've got to, like I said, I mean, that's where you just have to sort of step back and hand that little piece off, right? And say, well, I'll sort of trust that you guys know what you're talking about. Hopefully you're right. But it's funny you talk about, going back to, people requesting songs that sometimes you think, oh, geez, I don't even know what key that's in. I wouldn't even know what it's at. I love that anecdote about Mary's New Car. And he was like, oh, you should play that tonight, as if we'd remember it. No, we don't remember how to play that song, But so I had a quick question on when you talk about, you do this in pandemic, you've got people in LA, you've got people in Europe, you've got people all over the place contributing to these songs. Is it then, well, it must be more work to get a cohesive album out of it rather than it just becoming a set of songs? Like, how do you feel that it came together as an album versus sort of a snapshot of lots of different songs? Do you think is that something the album does?
I think the songs themselves are, I mean, there were more songs, but these are the ones we chose because they're sort of a piece.
Okay.
They do fit together.
Yeah.
A lot of it for me has to do with the fact that there was a producer. It wasn't me corralling all these people, but there was one person, Eric Lichter, who was, not that he had a particular vision for it, but there is a connectedness in the style. Right. No matter who, whether if it's Mick Talbot from the Style Council or Ron from the Heartbreakers, it's got to be cohesive. Okay.
Yeah.
And then I think the biggest trick was so there's this guy named Dwayne Lundy who mixed it. And because of the way we made the record, we over-tracked, we over-recorded. There were too many guitars and too many keyboards and too many. And I had a lot of conversations with him, not listening and but like, let's go for, there were records I pointed to that, that we were going for a particular vibe, Yeah. So that there was a cohesiveness, so that when he went to put pieces together, even if it was, something by a relatively famous person, if it didn't work or didn't fit, it didn't work or it didn't fit.
Yeah.
Because beginning to end, it had to feel like a cohesive whole, and it had to feel, I said this, I think this was somewhere in the press release, that it was like, it's sort of a manifesto of sorts, that my first record with The Badge in 98 my old band, felt like, I was making an artistic statement. And then my first solo album in 2012 felt like this feels like, sort of a stylistic shift. It feels like, and so I wanted it to sound that way. I wanted it to sound like I'd learned something, and that it wasn't just the next because all due respect to the records I made in between the record in 2012, Birds of Paradox, and this one, one was for fun and one was on deadline, and I love them both for different reasons, but this was more, I had something to say. And so when I described to him the mood I wanted it to have, what I wanted it to evoke in people, I think as somebody who knows how to like the last record I mixed with an engineer, but I turned this over and said, these are the emotions I'm trying to evoke. Do your magic,
Right.
And so I think that's a huge part of it. And there were certainly times when it would come back and I'd be like, I'd be missing parts that I love or whatever it was. But I think also, I had to accept that the whole was greater than the little, details that I might have wanted to hear here or there. That would have cluttered it up. Somebody said to me the other day, how you can hear every instrument and it doesn't feel cluttered. And I think that's a really important thing in this day and age.
I'm laughing because I'd written down pretty much that exact same thing on this song that I just listened to. Like, there's a lot going on in this song, and I've just finished. So the last two seasons of the podcast have been Full Moon Fever, Into the Great Wide Open. There is a lot more going on those records than you necessarily think until you really listen to them. So getting that separation of sound and getting the right mixer engineer on an album like this, it's incredibly important. How important is that, do you think, having an outside voice as a producer? Because I think, to my ear, always a lot of Southern accents when there were different producers, or Tom and Mike were kind of producing alone, and Let Me Up I've had enough, where they didn't have an outside voice. There was no, there was no editor who wasn't close to the songs. I think those are the weakest songs, weakest albums in terms of production. And I think having that outside and saying, I know that you like that little sort of guitar run there, but I think we should lose it because it's maybe clashing with this frequency. So having somebody who'll say that and sort of take those songs and look at them from that perspective, how important do you think that is? And especially with this album, if you are trying to say something cohesive.
I don't know that I was trying to say something cohesive, but I wanted to feel cohesive.
Okay.
It's very hard as an artist when you are presenting essentially your new babies to the world to turn over artistic license to another person. But I also think, with time and experience comes the recognition. I mean, early on, I was always happy to work with a producer. And then I went through a long period where I had some bad experiences too. And I worked with some very famous people, and they don't always know better. And we'd get to the end and neither of us liked it. So, it's funny how that works. Having that trust and also knowing that at any point, I ultimately can make a decision. It's not like I'm on Columbia Records and they're, forcing somebody on me. It was a choice that Eric and I made to work together because we wanted to for a really long time. We talked about it for 15 years. So yeah, I mean, I think it's partly trust and also partly knowing that, there was a safety net, but, I think it isn't always the case that more ears make things better. But I think at a certain point in your life, you have to have a sense for who's good and who's bad, or who, because here's the thing too, Eric and I don't necessarily agree. I mean, he's a big fan of like CSNY and or CSN and the Laurel Canyon Sen and whatever. And he would do these layered backing vocals, and it would sound like the fucking Eagles to me. And I was like, no more with the Eagles. But I also knew in mixing that the guy who was going to mix it was going to use what he needed and not use what he didn't need, and whatever. And then, and at one point, that's what I was talking about earlier, working at Mark Claddy's studio. I went in and Mark and I did some of the backing vocals to rough them up a little bit, because Eric has a very smooth voice and they were very sort of Beach Boys, Eaglesy. And I, when we added ours in, they had a little more edge to them.
Right.
And so then when Duane went in and mixed them, he could sort of mix and match. If one song needed soft, he had soft. If one song, another song needed a little rougher. So, yeah, I mean, I cannot stress enough, and this is something I've only just realized recently, how crucial Duane's role as the mixer in the process has been to it.
Yeah. Because
he made sense of, here's the perfect example. I don't know that Tom Petty fans will know this so much, but you will, that there's a great record in Be Here Now, but because of the way it was mixed and it was on deadline, and because of where they were at artistically and as people, we got 70 minutes brick walled.
Yeah, 100%.
And, it's not that those songs aren't good, because if you hear the demos, Noel's demos from Mesquite on the, in the box set, there's some great songs in there.
They're better than what came out on the album.
Yeah.
In a lot of cases, they are 100%. I'm totally on board with this conversation. Yeah.
None of them needed to be 7 minutes. None of them needed to have a minute intro and a minute outro. And he would admit that now, but he also can't face remixing it. But fans have done edits and they're fantastic. But it needs more than that. It needed a lighter touch, a little less bombast, but that's not where they were at. And they weren't in a place. And I've been that age. I've been 27. I've known, or whatever they were at the time. And I've you think you have all the answers, and they certainly felt like they had all the answers, and that's what you get, right?
Yeah.
In retrospect, I think we can all agree. I think most people can agree who've really paid attention. There's a pretty great record there. It's just not there right now.
Not as good as it should be. Yeah, 100%.
Not as good as it should be. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. No, that's, well, I mean, okay. So, well, I might ask you a question then. Are you happy with the album?
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. It's like I've I mean, you're always proud of anything you do when it comes out, because it's exciting. You get caught up in the momentum of it. But I've had the great luxury of this having been done for an extended period of time. And before I started doing these interviews in the last week or so, I went back and listened to it. Like, I just late at night, put on the headphones and listened to it beginning to end. And I thought, wow, that's something. Yeah. And that's pretty exciting. I mean, there's always things you wish you'd done differently, or there's, you always want to second guess yourself, but it sounds great. And I'm really tickled that, there's a lot of people on it who I've admired my whole career, So, I mean, Petty fans will relate to this, but, I remember being over one of my best friend's houses in the 70s, and his brother had the first two Heartbreakers records. And we would borrow them without him knowing. And we were really into them. And then right around that same time, Damn the Torpedoes came out. And I remember being totally knocked out. Like, every song on that record is amazing. And the sound of it is so fantastic. And, people, it's hard now for second or third generation fans to relate to hearing it the first time in 1979. But I think and Hard Promises was very important to me too, maybe even more important because I was more aware as a musician at that time. But I think the most interesting thing to me is that, I now know these guys, but also the guy who played bass on those records, which when you think of American Girl in your head and you think of that intro, it's that bass
it's Ron
part it's Ron, right?
yeah,
so he's on the record. That's a full circle thing. That as a even just as a music fan blows my mind. So that's so my relationship to the record is probably it will evolve over time after we played the song some and people have reacted to it, but it's for me it's just exciting. Yeah.
And so album comes out in May, and I'm sure then are we looking forward to a tour? What's the plan for sort of once the album hits shelves?
Yeah, it's a little in the work. I mean, yes, the answer is yes.
Okay.
May right now is full of shows. And May is always full of shows. October is pretty full of shows. We're trying to figure out if we're going to go overseas, maybe do the UK and Europe.
Nice.
We'd gotten an offer to do essentially a festival at the end of July, which is going to allow me to go for an extended period of time and play smaller places. You get enough for a gig like that where it can kind of offset if you're playing in Sheffield or wherever it is. I love my people in Sheffield. I actually have some very adamant very serious fans in Sheffield, so I'm no disrespect to Sheffield, but smaller crowd than a big festival. So and that I guess isn't going to happen. So we're now trying to figure out, right now I'll probably go over, do the obvious places, do maybe a launch, kind of an acoustic gig in London and a full gig in London, probably do, Liverpool and the L's, Liverpool, Leeds, and Leicester, the places where you can draw a decent crowd, like that. So it's all TBD, but right now in America, we're doing May and October and then filling in the gaps as they come. But, it's weird. There's already stuff. We're already talking about stuff for 25. So it's, again, I try not to get too involved in that stuff.
Yeah. And I assume, are you going to be in Gainesville again this year? Hopefully.
I love playing there, and we had an amazing time in 22 and an even better time in 23. I mean, my band did double duty because they backed me up, but they also backed up Jake Thistle, which was, they worked really hard. And then we also did the All-Star Jam. So that was a lot of work, but it's one of my favorite events of the year. I can't imagine. We had last year, we did a Dylan Fest in Duluth, Minnesota. We did a Dylan Fest in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where they have his archive. And then we did the Petty weekend in Gainesville. So last year was really, again, those things were all set up, assuming that the record was going to be out.
Right.
So now we're in a position where we've done those things last year. Now the record's out, but we did those things last year. So I have to respect if those promoters are like, well, we'll bring in 25, but we don't want to bring it this year. But yeah, I think Gainesville, if I have to go down there, by myself without the band, I would 100% do it.
Yeah.
Because I just had the best time in the world, and the people are amazing. And I, there's so many people I know from Tom Petty Nation and so forth. So yeah, it's just a good time. But, the difference between doing it in 2022 with a local band who were great, and last year with my own band, who had been on the road the entire month of October playing those songs, and it's just a different thing. Totally. It's no offense to the people who backed me up in 22 because they were fantastic, but they were almost strangers. Yeah. Right. They're trying to figure me out, and I'm trying to figure them out on stage in front of however many people. Yeah. Whereas, we had technical issues and we had all the usual things with my band, and it was like, everybody just kind of filled in the gap and, made it happen. So yeah, hopefully it will happen, if not this year, next year. But I'm that's a long-winded answer to say I want to come.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm really, really, really hoping you're there for selfish reasons because I'm going to be able to get down there this year. So I've got it in my calendar in ink. It was in pencil up until about a month ago. Now it's in ink. So I'm really, really excited to see a bunch of people down there. I mean, it's going to be it's always a good time down there, and like I said,
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to it because I love this first single. Very genuinely. I mean, people come on and you sort of have to say, well, I listen to everything. But for Petty fans, this song you're going to be able to get in. I mean, "Broken Without You" is the name of the lead single. You're gonna find a very easy way into this. It's something that you're gonna be familiar with. There's organ on there, there's piano on there, there's multi-layer guitars. There's a very Mike Campbell-esque kind of rock and roll guitar solo, or two actually. We've got two guitar solos. So there's lots of entry points for Tom Petty fans. I think you're gonna love this song, and I think it's a good portent for how good the album's gonna be. I really hope that people listen to it. And
I appreciate that. I mean, I think we talked about Weller, we talked about Tom Petty earlier, and Dylan, and all these people, and I don't think my music sounds like any of them.
No,
but I also
sounds like you.
It sounds like me. I understand that, but it also, I think, for fans of that kind of music, it is old style rock and roll, which is what those guys play.
Yeah,
and if you like, kind of Americana music with an R&B vibe, which is what those guys make. Yeah. I think like you said, you'll find the entry point.
Fantastic. So where can people find you, Jeff? Tell people where they can find you on social media, your website. Where can they find the album? And give us the dates again when things come out.
So I'm Jeff Slate everywhere on social media. The website is jeffslatehq.com. Live dates are always on there. The first single, "Broken Without You," is out on streaming services now. The album comes out, I believe it's May 17th around the world. And it's beautiful. It comes with, so the infamous or famous photographer Bob Gruen shot the cover, who shot John Lennon and the Pistols and the Clash and, all these people. And when you buy the record, the front cover photo slides out. It's a little Bob Gruen print. So it's very fancy. Yeah, it's very it's very swanky. We'll send you one. And so that's out May 17th. And I think the album's 10 or 11 tracks. And then there's a bunch of bonus tracks, which are like the singles that have already been out and remixes and things like that. So it's, it's a nice little package for your hard-earned dollars. But I will tell you a story that I thought of earlier when we were talking about things where, so when I was a kid, obviously there was a record store in my town where, on release day, I'd go down there on the bus with my little, paper route money or whatever the hell it was, and get the new releases. And I remember when Double Fantasy came out, I went down and got Double Fantasy, took it home, and I had the liner notes. So I'm at home, and I'm reading all these, and there's this guy Earl Slick who plays on Double Fantasy. Flash forward to a couple of years ago, we played at an outdoor festival in my hometown, and I'm on stage with Slick, and we were facing where that record store used to be. Right? And so I'm playing, I think we played a Lennon song. Like I just said, I wanted to do it just to tell the story. That if that isn't full circle, if that isn't like an amazing trajectory where, and I get notes, regularly from friends of mine, particularly when records come out or something, significant happens in my career, people I grew up with who are like, I can't believe you do what you said you were going to do when you were 12 years old. That's crazy. And, I think part of it's tenacity, but part of it is just, it's just luck. It's just happened, so to be standing on that stage with him across from that record store, it's like, how does that happen?
But it's also a lot of really, really hard work. There is a lot of perspiration there, and I know that you are a guy who works very hard.
I mean, but it's. I was talking to a manager friend of mine the other day, and he said, "I'd gotten, as people can tell, I got a cold from, we did an event, we did a meet and greet afterwards, and I signed a bunch of stuff, and all the usual, took a bunch of selfies. Of course, I got a cold. It isn't COVID, but it's pretty bad." And he said, "You got to remember They're paying you to play, not to work.
Yeah.
And that's a really good way to think about it. Like and I wasn't complaining. I never, I'm just incredibly fortunate to be doing what I do for a living. By the same token, like you said, it's work. The part of it that, when my son was really young, he wanted to be Liam Gallagher. I don't know what that meant, but he would stand he would make a little microphone stand out of whatever plastic stuff, little fake microphone, and he'd stand with his hands behind his back, and he'd sing at the TV. and at the time, I'm pretty good friends with Pete Townsend, and he said, "I'll bring him to the Who show. I want to show him around." And so Pete took him around. He was like 4 or 5 years old.
Oh,
took him
my
around
God.
backstage. I know. Took him around backstage and showed him around to like the catering and the trucks.
Yeah.
And the lighting rig guys and all the Teamster guys, setting up and working their asses off to put this show on. To give him a sense that, he also let him stand on the stage when the lights went up in Madison Square Garden, and that was the end of that. So much for that lesson. But he did give him a sense that it's a lot of work, that it takes a lot of people working really hard to make this happen.
Yeah. And
it's not just about, the bells and whistles. So it's people, again, I'm not complaining, and I'm not trying to dismiss the fact that it's an amazing way to make a living, but yeah, it's just a great job. It's a job. Yeah. It's a great one.
Well, a job that I always get the sense that you just love it. There's and every post I see on Facebook, you clearly, every interview that I read that you post is like, yeah, this guy just loves music. And that's why I think I always sort of felt this a little bit of a connection, because it's like, I get this guy. I know where this comes from. I'm exactly the same in that kind of regard. So
yeah, I'm excited to have a record out. I'm excited to work with these people. I'm excited to be friends with Ron and Dave Stewart and, whoever else. I'm excited to interview Johnny Marr, that came out a couple of weeks ago or whatever. It's like, or Chrissy Hynde, earlier in the year. It's, that's an incredibly fortunate position to be in. How could I grumble about that?
Yeah.
So, and look, the state of music journalism and the state of the media is terrible right now. I just happen to be in a position where, because I have both music and writing, I can almost pick and choose my projects. That's a very, very special place to be.
Yeah.
So I have no complaints in that. But there's no bad news in this.
Well, there we go, folks. Jeff Slate has returned. He's got a new album coming out. Go check out the single immediately. But I like getting money to artists, because Spotify and Apple doesn't pay people, right? So I always like trying to. So when the CD comes out, folks, go buy real media. It's not a lost art. And even if you then stream it, go buy a record, because it does make a difference for artists. Go see Jeff play, because he's playing all the time. You can go see the Wilburys, you can go see Dylan, any of these Bowie. I just saw you were doing some Bowie tribute.
Yeah, we did a Bowie show. Yeah, look, that is, please buy the merch. We've got nice shirts and nice T-shirts and CDs and all that other stuff. Put a lot of effort into that, and that all drops to the bottom line. But come to the live shows. That is the thing that makes it. It used to be that the artists were doing the labels a favor by promoting these records, so they would give us some support to go out on the road. Now it's the other way around. Yep. It's like the not that the labels are hurting by any stretch of the imagination, but they may or may not make their money back. But once I'm out on the road, that's money that drops to my bottom line. So it's, that is what keeps it going. And that's why we do, we'll do a big chunk of shows in May and a big chunk of shows in October. And that will essentially keep us going for the bulk of the year. So, that's, but again, no complaints.